What it comes down to for me is this. Will the technologies of communication in our culture serve to enlighten us and help us understand one another better? Or will they deceive us and keep us apart? Roger Waters. Welcome to EOS Weekly. Today, we are going to explain why the concept of a constitution has become obsolete. But in order to do this, we need to start with the basics of EOS governance. Please bear with us for a minute if some of this is a refresher for you. So, how is EOS a governed blockchain? There are three key features that EOS-IO chains possess, which puts EOS squarely in the governed category of blockchains. First, there are the block producer elections. The token holders each have a certain amount of ownership or stake in the blockchain, and the more stake a given account has, the more voting power that account has. The token holders vote with their stake to elect 21 delegates to be the stewards of the blockchain. We call these delegates block producers. Secondly, in the next layer of governance, these block producers then vote amongst themselves via a 2/3 supermajority vote on certain things. The BPs do this so as to get a consensus as to when to implement certain types of EOS-IO software enhancements and config changes, or when to reject them. They will also vote on whether to use their special BP enforcement powers, such as blacklisting, graylisting, changing keys on an account, etc. Basically, the block producers are voting to determine how their EOS-IO blockchain will behave and how it will be configured so that it'll have a consistent configuration across all nodes of the network, which is important. The primary signal that block producers watch to gauge how well they're doing in their role as stewards of the network is the number of tokens that the token holders have voted their way. This is quite an important signal to the BPs because it determines whether they remain employed as a block producer or not. We, the token holders, the voters, we monitor the block producers. We watch how they behave in these supermajority votes. Then we ask them questions about why they voted this way or that way. How the BPs vote in these supermajority ballots is one of the crucial behaviors that differentiates one block producer from another. In fact, it is arguably the most important, most distinguishing characteristic of block producers, along with their extracurricular contributions and their geographic location. Giving block producers the volition, the freedom to vote according to their own value system, and allowing block producers to stay true to their own convictions is what gives meaning to these supermajority votes. If the BPs were given orders and forced to vote this way or that way on certain issues, it would take meaning away from these supermajority votes. The reason why we're talking about all this is because there's a recurring topic that keeps resurfacing among the EOS community, a debate we keep having over and over again in the Telegram chats and elsewhere. The specific circumstances of the debate are different every time, but the underlying opposing viewpoints in these debates is consistent. And what this recurring debate really boils down to is this. What type of messages should external entities be able to send to our elected block producers? Should external entities only be empowered to send signals to the BPs, like recommendations? Or should we enable external entities to send orders to our BPs? The controversial ECAF debate has been centered around this very question. Should ECAF be limited to issuing signals to the BPs, which the BPs should then analyze themselves first before taking any action? Or should ECAF be empowered to issue orders to the block producers? Orders that the block producers would be expected to not analyze, but instead should mindlessly approve and execute those orders as if the BPs were automatons. This same question has been surfacing again recently, only now its form has changed slightly. Which brings us to our third feature, which makes EOS a governed blockchain, the referendum system. This is how we poll the token holders to see how they feel about any and all issues. Just released a few weeks ago, token holders have already begun using the referendum system to write up proposals and vote on them, which you can see here. And so the new question that's been surfacing lately is this. Will the referendum system become a signal issuing entity or an order issuing entity. If we did want it to be an order issuing entity, it would mean for BPs to mindlessly implement all referenda that surpass a certain threshold, and mindlessly refuse any referenda that fall below that threshold. Or do we want our BPs to use their own judgment and treat the referendums more as signals to be analyzed and acted upon by each BP individually? Officially, for a referendum to pass, according to our current constitution, there is a threshold we have to reach of 15% voter participation with 10% more yes votes than no votes sustained over a 30-day period. Now, what if the EOS community gets very close to that threshold on a given proposal, but doesn't quite achieve it? Should the BPs be required to not move forward? In general, there are two schools of thought as to how to answer this question. One school repeatedly comes out in favor of orders. The other school wants those orders to be tapered down and to be considered nothing more than signals. A good portion of the heated debates that arise in the EOS Telegram channels and elsewhere have been between people of these opposing viewpoints. To explore these two schools of thought, let's start by examining an event that made the division between these two schools crystal clear to many EOS community members who might not have been aware of the division previously. This event transpired a little over a month ago on December 25th, Christmas Day. Christmas Day was the final day for BPs to approve this order from the ECAF. And what happened? The BPs quietly let this ECAF ruling expire. They did not follow the order. This was the block producer collective mind speaking and saying out loud in a clear, articulate voice that from this point forward, ECAF messages would be interpreted as signals, not orders. Now, the division between these two schools of thought was always present, but this event on Christmas Day caused the dividing line to become abundantly clear due to the feud it spurred between two prominent community members. Those two community members, who were clearly on opposing sides of our dividing line here, were Thomas Cox of the Alliance and Michael Yates of the eosDAC block producer. Michael has been vocal about his stance that BPs should treat external entities as signal-emitting entities only and should vote freely in their supermajority decisions, and that BPs should not necessarily be constrained by the Constitution, especially the first version of the Constitution, which most in the community openly recognize as flawed. Thomas, on the other hand, sees the Constitution as something to be adhered to. And when the BPs ignored that ECAF order on Christmas Day, and Thomas saw Michael Yates' vocal opposition to BPs following the Constitution, Thomas announced that he would be using voter activism to basically make an example out of eosDAC. Thomas was going to go on a whale tour to inform them of the eosDAC stance on the Constitution. Now, this particular conflict between Thomas and Michael, while it caused a lot of drama for a day or so, it blew over pretty quickly. eosDAC wrote up a nice blog post, which you can see here, clarifying their stance on things. And this was enough for Thomas to call off his voter activism tour. The only reason we tell this story is because it was a highly polarized and highly visible confrontation between these two prominent members of the community, each of whom want EOS to succeed, but because they hold opposing philosophical viewpoints, the two end up arriving at much different solutions to the problems that EOS is facing. But the good news is that once you understand these two opposing schools of thought, you not only better understand this recent feud between Michael and Thomas, but you'll also see that for a lot of the debates taking place among the EOS community today, many of them arise from the exact same philosophical differences. The difference comes from two schools of thought under libertarian political philosophy. Under libertarianism, there are the minarchists and there are the anarcho-capitalists. Both are forms of libertarianism, Both believe in limited government and individual freedoms, but they each have a slightly different view as to how government fits into the picture. Minarchists are in favor of a minimal amount of government. In Minarchism, government is limited to the function of providing protection for its citizenry. Protection from aggression, theft, breach of contract, fraud, and enforcing property laws. Still libertarian, but slightly different from the minarchists, are the anarcho-capitalists. Anarcho-capitalists want even less government than the minarchists. They even believe in taking responsibility for their own protection, potentially by employing a private service to help provide them that protection. In general, a minarchist in the EOS world would be pro-ECAF. They'd be in favor of the ECAF issuing orders to the BPs. A minarchist would see ECAF as a minimal form of government that the blockchain citizenry need. They need it for protection. The way minarchists see it, there needs to be an entity outside of the BPs that can oversee them. Because what if the BPs themselves need to be policed? What if the BPs break the rules? Anarcho-capitalists would be opposed to ECAF. They don't like orders in general. The anarcho-capitalists believe people should only make recommendations to one another. Orders might even be construed as a form of violence to an anarcho-capitalist. Anarcho-capitalists don't want protection from any external agency. They believe people should protect themselves. In the EOS world, this would mean intelligently managing their own accounts, setting up different owner and active keys using a multi-sig account, and so on. Anarcho-capitalists prefer to provide their own protection through free market principles, whether they do it themselves or hire a private entity, something like Chestnut, to help them stay secure. Let's look at vote buying now. For the minarchists, vote buying is an example as to why we might need some sort of external entity to oversee the BPs, and potentially issue an order when they suspect misbehavior on the part of one or more BPs. Anarcho-capitalists are less concerned about vote buying. From the anarcho-capitalist viewpoint, the free market is the best solution to most problems, and vote buying fits nicely into that free market viewpoint, which makes them okay with it. In general, the first version of the Constitution was written from the point of view of a minarchist libertarian. The second version that Dan Larimer proposed in his Intent of Code is Law post, this new version of the Constitution is more anarcho-capitalist minded. The Bytemaster version here is more about signals and less about orders. Now, when it comes to the referendum proposals, the minarchists will say that there are rules here, and those rules must be followed. There is a certain threshold that referendum proposals must meet. Above that threshold, and it's as if the referendum system issues an order to the BPs to move forward. So when the code for this item is ready, the BPs will dutifully vote yes to approve that deployment via a supermajority vote and deploy the change. And if the referendum does not meet the required threshold, well, that is just as good as an order to not implement any changes related to that proposal. And if this is the case, all the BPs had better vote no in any supermajority ballot, or else they risk facing repercussions from the minarchist overseer. The anarcho-capitalists would see the referendum system in a less stringent way. They'd see the referendum system just like everything else, as a signal. And anarcho-capitalists would prefer to let the BPs interpret for themselves whether the referendum proposal has enough votes to greenlight the project. Block.one has clearly moved from the minarchist mindset over to the anarcho-capitalist mindset. You can see how they shifted in this direction way back in June when Dan Larimer released his Intent of Code is Law post with this revised constitution in it. Brendan Bloomer, in his tweets and Telegram messages in early January, clarified for all of us that Block.one was not just dipping a toe in the anarcho-capitalist school of thought. Brendan showed us that Block.one had jumped into anarcho-capitalism with both feet. The EOS community appears to be following them there, looking at how the community is voting in some of these early referendum proposals so far. While there are still people holding firm in the minarchist camp over here, this group is now a minority, a small but vocal minority. The majority of the community has gradually crossed over to this new land over here. And what we're finding as we move into this philosophical direction is that defining a single constitution to rule all block producers is a lost cause. It doesn't fit in with this new anarcho-capitalist viewpoint. Because what we're realizing is that there is not a single block producer that can be ruled by a constitution. And there isn't a single constitution that aligns with all block producer values. Block producers are their own independent agencies with their own independent faculties, independent thoughts, values, and convictions. And the collective group of BPs cannot and should not be ruled by any one document. Therefore, if we were to have any constitution at all, what would make the most sense would be for each block producer to publish their own constitution. Decentralize it. Let each individual block producer tell us, the voting populace, how they will behave in the supermajority votes. When they get signals from ECAF, what will they do with them? And what will their threshold be when considering whether a referendum proposal was good enough to move forward with? Instead of trying to force all BPs to abide by the same constitution, let's recommend to every BP to publicize their own individual constitution. In fact, to take it a step further, let's recommend that no two BPs plagiarize one another's constitution. We, the voters, prefer that every block producer constitution be unique. It's good for diversification and ultimately makes the chain that much more decentralized. Imagine a world like that, where every BP has their own unique constitution. A world where we could adjust the course that our blockchain is on by voting BPs in and out based on their publicized constitution. The BPs could, of course, change their stance on things at any time. As new information becomes available, for example, if a referendum proposal reveals a surprising sentiment among token holders, BPs could adjust their constitution so as to stay in sync with their perceived views on what the EOS community desires. The tide is turning in the favor of the anarcho-capitalists. The trend is clear. If you're a BP watching this video, you could show the community that you are a forward-thinking block producer by declaring your independence, by publishing your own independent block producer constitution. Those BPs who make a bold stance in this direction will be favored in the long run. They will be looked back upon as the pioneers who set a new precedent and paved the way forward for others. Please reach out to us if you are a BP who is interested in moving forward with this approach. We will recognize you with praise in an upcoming episode. That's it for this week's episode. We hope you learned something. Please subscribe to our channel if you haven't done so already. We'll help you stay current on EOS as this revolution unfolds. Thanks, and we'll see you next week, right here on EOS Weekly.